The name of the town was Corsicana, though the women who worked in the velvet rooms called it by no name at all. They called it the place. It lay in the heat-baked flatland of central Texas, where oil wells punched the earth like nails into flesh, and the smell of crude and desperation hung over everything. The saloons, the boarding houses, the red brick buildings where fortunes turned to rust. Mercy Cline was 32 years old, though she moved through the velvet rooms like a ghost, as though age had already claimed her long ago. Her face still held traces of what it once was, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that had learned not to show fear, but her hands betrayed her. They were the hands of a woman who had scrubbed floors, picked cotton, and lived through things that erased softness from the body. She had come to Corsicana 7 years prior, fleeing a marriage that had become a tomb. Her husband, Samuel, had been a railroad worker who drank whiskey the way other men drank water. He had not wanted her to leave, and she had not asked permission. She had taken a dress, $2 silver, and a name that was not her own. In Corsicana, no one asked questions. The town was too young, too hungry, too full of men with money and empty eyes to notice that Mercy Cline was running from something, or that Mercy Cline was not her real name at all. The Velvet Rooms occupied a large adobe structure on Commerce Street, 3 stories of darkness and carefully painted wood. It had been built by a woman named Dolores Ramos, a former prostitute who had somehow accumulated enough money and nerve to own the place, instead of merely working inside it. Dolores was 60 now, her face carved into something ancient by sun and time. She ran the Velvet Rooms with a ledger, a pistol, and a silence that was more terrifying than any shout. Mercy had worked there for 5 years. She had saved money in small amounts, hidden away in the lining of an old shoe beneath the floorboards of her room. She did not know what she was saving for. Freedom was an abstraction, a word that meant something different in Corsicana than it did elsewhere. Freedom here meant being able to refuse a customer once every 6 months. It meant eating meat on Sunday. It meant not sleeping in the room with 3 other women. The heat that autumn was biblical. It had not rained in 47 days, and the earth had begun to crack like old skin. The oil wells coughed through the night, and the men who worked them came to the Velvet Rooms with money and thirst and a kind of rage that lived in their chests like a second heart. Mercy had learned to move through them like water through a sieve. She showed up. She smiled. She did what was required, and she felt nothing. Or rather, she felt so much that feeling had become a kind of numbness. It was on an afternoon in late September, while Dolores was at the market, that Mercy discovered the well. She had been in the back courtyard where the girls sometimes hung wet clothes to dry. The yard was surrounded by an adobe wall that had begun to crumble at the corners. Beyond that wall lay the scrubland that extended all the way to the horizon, bleached white by the sun. There was a small stone structure in the corner of the courtyard, no more than 4 feet wide, covered in a wooden grate that had been broken and tied shut with strips of leather. Mercy had walked past it 100 times without really seeing it. That afternoon something made her stop. The grate had come loose at one corner. The leather strip had rotted in the heat. She could see beneath the broken slats a sliver of black space that seemed to descend very far down. A well. An abandoned well. She knelt down and pulled at the grate. It came away easier than she expected. The leather crumbled to dust in her fingers. The grate, once exposed, revealed a stone circle perhaps 2 feet in diameter, with iron rings set into the mortar at intervals, descending into blackness. Mercy had not expected anything from a well. Wells were ordinary things, but there was something about the way this one was abandoned, the way it had been hidden beneath a broken grate and forgotten by everyone in the house, even by Dolores, it seemed. That made her breath catch in her throat. She pulled her rebozo, her shawl, tighter around her shoulders, though it was far too hot for such a thing. She should have left the well alone. She should have put the grate back and forgotten about it. Instead, she leaned over the opening. "Hello?" she said. Her voice was small and strange in the dry air. Nothing answered. She waited. The heat pressed down from above. The oil wells wheezed in the distance. The town moved on around her, horse hooves, voices, the distant ring of metal on metal from the smithy 3 blocks over. All of that life continued, indifferent and thick. Then she heard it. It was not a sound exactly. It was something that moved through the air like a presence, like a hand brushing past her ear in the darkness. It might have been the wind moving through the well's depths. It might have been water far below, disturbed by some shift in the earth. It might have been an animal, a trapped thing moving in the dark. But it had sounded for just a moment like breathing. Mercy jerked back from the opening. Her heart was moving very fast in her chest. She stood up, her knees unsteady. The courtyard looked exactly as it had before. The same cracked adobe, the same heat shimmer rising from the stones, the same absolute silence of a town built on money and suffering. She did not tell anyone about the well. Instead, she thought about it, all that evening and into the night as she lay in her bed in the room she shared with 2 other women. She thought about the breathing from the dark. She thought about the well's abandonment, the way it had been hidden, the way no one in the velvet rooms had ever mentioned it, not in 5 years. Dolores was a woman who controlled every detail of the house. Surely she knew about the well. Surely she had chosen not to speak of it. The question was why. The next morning, before the other women woke, Mercy went back to the courtyard. The well was exactly as she had left it. The broken grate lay beside the stone circle. The darkness below seemed deeper than it had the day before, or perhaps that was only her imagination. She sat on the edge of the well, her feet dangling over the black. There was still no sound. The air that rose from below was neither warm nor cold. It was neutral, like the air inside a tomb. "I know you're there," she said aloud. She did not know why she said this. She did not know who she was speaking to. There was nothing rational about it, but there was also something about the well that demanded to be addressed, to be acknowledged. There was something that lived in that darkness, and it was not the darkness itself. It was something conscious, something aware. "What do you want?" she asked. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, so faintly that she almost missed it, she heard it again. That sound that might have been breathing, or wind, or the settling of the earth's very bones beneath the town. And beneath that something else, something that sounded almost like a voice, or the memory of a voice, carried up from a distance so vast that it had forgotten how to speak. Mercy closed her eyes. She understood in that moment that she had been drawn to the well for a reason. She understood that something, some force, some hunger, some buried history, was calling to her specifically. Not to Dolores, not to the other women, to her. She did not know whether to be terrified or relieved. Chapter 2. The Whisper in the Dark. Mercy began to visit the well every morning before dawn, in that hour when the velvet room still slept and the town beyond the walls was not yet awake. She would kneel at the edge of the stone circle and listen. Sometimes there was only silence. Sometimes there was that sound, the sound that might have been breathing or might have been many things. She began to bring things with her. A cup of water, a piece of bread. She would lower them on a string as far as the string would go and wait to see if anything took them. The cups and bread would vanish into the darkness, whether by her own act of forgetting them or by something else she could not say. She did not speak of any of this to the other women. She did not speak of it to Dolores. She kept it locked inside herself, a secret that felt heavier each day, like a stone growing in her chest. By the middle of October she had begun to hear words. They were not clear. They were not words in English or Spanish or any language she could fully comprehend, but they had the rhythm of speech. They had intention, and they sounded always like they were rising from a great distance. As though someone at the bottom of the world was trying to call up to her, she tried to speak back. At first she only said simple things. "I am here. I can hear you. What is your name?" But the well did not answer directly. Instead, she began to have dreams. In the dreams, she was not Mercy Cline. She was a woman named Cecilia, and she was walking through the Corsicana that existed perhaps 30 years before, a smaller town, made of wood instead of brick, full of soldiers and chaos. In the dream, Cecilia was young, perhaps 19, with skin the color of cinnamon and eyes that had not yet learned to hide. She was walking through the dark toward a fire that burned in the distance. In the dream, men were shouting. Their voices had the edge of violence in them, the sharp sound of authority mixed with cruelty. Cecilia was afraid, but she was also angry. an anger so pure and complete that it burned through her fear like acid. The dream would go no further. It would simply end, and she would wake in her narrow bed in the velvet rooms, her heart racing, her body covered in sweat. She began to write things down. Not much, a few words each morning, scraps of the dream she could remember. She hid the papers in the same place she hid her money, in the lining of her old shoe. She knew this was dangerous. If Dolores found evidence that Mercy was keeping secrets, there would be consequences. But the urge to record these fragments, to somehow make them real and permanent, was stronger than her fear. It was Dolores who first noticed something was wrong. It was a Saturday morning, the day when Dolores took inventory of the house, counting sheets and towels and checking the ledger to see which men owed money. She found Mercy in the courtyard, kneeling beside the well, her hand pressed against the stone edge. "What are you doing?" Dolores's voice was very quiet. Mercy turned. Dolores was standing in the doorway to the house, her frame filled with shadow. She was a large woman, broad in the shoulders, and the light did not reach her face. "Nothing," Mercy said. I found the well. I wondered why it was boarded up." For a long time Dolores did not speak. Then she came into the courtyard and stood over Mercy. She looked down at the well with an expression that might have been fear, or might have been disgust, or might have been both. "You stay away from that," Dolores said. "Why?" Mercy asked. "What is it?" "It is nothing. It is a dry well. It has been here since before I owned this place. It stays boarded up, that is all you need to know." But Dolores did not look away from the well as she spoke. And Mercy saw in that moment that Dolores was afraid. Dolores, who controlled the velvet rooms with the certainty of a woman who had seen everything and feared nothing, was afraid of the well. "There's something down there," Mercy said. She had not planned to say this. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. Dolores turned to look at her. Her face was hard as carved wood. "Do not speak about that again," she said. "Do not go near the well again. If I find you here again, you will leave the velvet rooms. Do you understand?" Mercy understood. She also understood that Dolores was lying. Dolores knew what was in the well. Dolores had always known. That night Mercy made a decision. She would leave the velvet rooms. She would take her money and go to Dallas or Houston or somewhere she could disappear into the crowds and rebuild her life as something other than what she had become. But first, she needed to know the truth about the well. She needed to know what Cecilia was trying to tell her from the darkness. She waited until the house was fully asleep. It was past 2 in the morning, that hour when even the most indefatigable drinkers and gamblers had finally exhausted themselves and returned to their rooms. She dressed in her darkest clothes, a black dress that had belonged to her when she first arrived in Corsicana years ago. She took a lantern from the kitchen, the old one that Dolores used for emergencies, and she went out to the courtyard. The well was waiting. She lit the lantern and held it over the opening. The light fell into the darkness below, revealing nothing but more darkness. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as though the light fell into infinity, as though the well descended not to the earth's water table, but to some other place entirely. "Cecilia," she called, "are you there?" The well did not answer. She found, beneath a pile of rubbish in the courtyard, an old rope. It was rotted and fraying, but it seemed strong enough. She tied it to one of the iron rings that descended into the well's depths. She tied it carefully, making sure the knot was tight. Then she wrapped the other end around her waist, leaving enough length so that if she fell, the rope might save her, or at least mark where her body could be found. She gathered her courage the way other women gathered their skirts. She took a breath, and then, before she could think about it further, she began to descend into the well. The walls were slick and cold. They were covered in something that might have been algae or slime, or the result of decades of dampness. The air grew colder as she descended. Her lantern swung wildly, throwing shadows that twisted and stretched like living things. She could hear her own breathing, loud and harsh in the confined space. She could hear the rope creaking as it took her weight. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, her feet touched something solid. She jumped and nearly lost her grip on the rope, but she steadied herself. She held the lantern down. She was standing on something, a platform or the remains of a platform. It was made of rotted wood and stone, and it was covered in water perhaps 6 inches deep. The water was cold and still, and her reflection in it looked like someone else entirely. In the lamplight, her face was a skull's face, all cheekbones and shadows. She turned the lantern slowly, trying to understand what she was looking at. The well opened up at the bottom. She was not standing in a simple stone well, but in what appeared to be a chamber. The walls around her were not natural. They had been carved. There were marks on them, regular marks that might have been made by tools or might have been something else. And there was something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. There were bones. They lay on the stone platform, half submerged in the water. They were old bones, bleached almost white by time and darkness. She could see a skull, the empty eye sockets staring up at nothing. She could see rib bones, finger bones, the architecture of a human skeleton in the process of dissolution. Mercy dropped the lantern. The lamp fell into the water and went out, plunging her into total darkness. She could not see anything. She could only feel the cold water around her ankles, the bone-deep chill that rose from the depths of the earth. She could only hear the sound of her own breathing, and beneath it that other sound, that sound that might have been a voice. It was coming from the walls themselves. It was coming from the darkness. It was coming from Cecilia, who had been waiting here for 30 years or 50 years or 100 years for someone to hear her, to acknowledge her, to know that she had existed and that what had been done to her mattered. Mercy did not scream. Instead, she climbed back up the rope. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely grip it. Her feet found the walls of the well and scrabbled for purchase. The rope swayed and twisted with her weight. Several times she nearly lost her grip and nearly fell back down into that terrible chamber with its cargo of bones and darkness, and the sound of a voice that had been screaming into the void for longer than she had been alive. But she climbed. She climbed until her hands touched the rim of the well, until she pulled herself over the edge and collapsed onto the courtyard stones, gasping for air, soaked through with sweat and water and the cold of the depths. For a long time she did not move. She lay there as though she were dead, her lungs working to pull air back into her body, her mind trying to understand what she had seen, what she had heard, what it meant. By the time she had recovered enough to stand, the sun was beginning to rise. The first light of dawn was touching the edges of the sky, turning them the color of blood. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 3. The Ledger of Names. Mercy said nothing to Dolores. She went about her days as though the well did not exist, as though she had not descended into that buried chamber, as though she had not seen the bones of a woman who had been left to decay in the darkness beneath the velvet rooms. But she was watching Dolores now. She noticed things she had overlooked before, the way Dolores kept a key on a chain around her neck, that key to a locked room on the 3rd floor that was never opened. She noticed the way Dolores's hands shook sometimes, as though she were fighting off some internal tremor. She noticed the way Dolores drank more than usual, cognac at night when she thought no one was looking. Mercy also began to ask questions. She asked the other girls if they knew anything about the well. They did not. They had been in the house for less time than Mercy had, most of them, and they knew only what Dolores had told them. The well was dry, it was dangerous, it was not to be touched. But one of the girls, a young woman named Rosa, who had been in Corsicana since she was 17, told Mercy something else. "There was a girl before you," Rosa said. "They were in the kitchen preparing lunch. Before I came, but I heard about her. She disappeared. Dolores said she ran away, but no one believed it. She was just gone one day." "How long ago?" Mercy asked. "I don't know. 5 years? 6? Dolores doesn't like to talk about it." 5 years. 6 years. Around the time that Mercy had arrived at the Velvet Rooms, around the time that Mercy had first begun to feel the well calling to her from beneath the courtyard stones, she began to search the house. Not openly, that would have been suicide, but in small increments, taking risks only when the opportunity presented itself. She searched Dolores's room, looking for anything that might explain the well, the locked room upstairs, the bones in the darkness. It was in a wooden trunk beneath Dolores's bed that she found the ledger. It was a small book, bound in leather, with a brass lock that Mercy picked open using a hairpin and a very steady hand. Inside were names and dates and amounts of money, all recorded in Dolores's precise economical handwriting. Most of the entries were straightforward. The names of girls, the dates they had arrived at the Velvet Rooms, the dates they had left. But there were other entries, and these were different. These had small marks next to them, marks that looked almost like grave markers, or like an X crossed through a name. Cecilia Fuentes, arrived August 1862, marked 1862 Maria del Carmen, arrived March 1878, marked 1878 Elena Gomez, arrived April 1884, marked 1884 Sofia Ruiz, arrived December 1889, marked 1890. The handwriting grew shakier as the dates progressed. By the last entry, the pen had pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. There were more names after Sofia Ruiz, but they were not marked. They were simply listed, as though they were ordinary transactions in an ordinary ledger. Mercy sat on the floor of Dolores's room, the ledger open in her hands, and felt her understanding of the world shift like sand beneath her feet. She had known that Dolores was capable of cruelty. Cruelty was the language of the Velvet Rooms, spoken by every woman who lived there and every man who visited it. But this was something else. This was something that transcended simple cruelty. The marked names. There were 13 of them. 13 women, spread across nearly 30 years, who had disappeared from the Velvet Rooms. 13 women who had been recorded in Dolores's ledger with the same precision that she recorded the price of sheet. She heard footsteps in the hallway. She shoved the ledger back beneath the bed and slipped out of Dolores's room, closing the door quietly behind her. She made it down the stairs and back to the kitchen, just as Dolores appeared in the hall, moving with her usual heavy certainty. "Where have you been?" Dolores asked. "Kitchen," Mercy said. "I was preparing the evening meal." Dolores looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and moved past her, but Mercy saw the muscle twitch in her jaw, saw the way her hand clenched. Dolores was afraid. That night, Mercy made a decision that would change everything. She had seen enough. She had heard enough. She had the ledger, the bones, the knowledge of 13 women who had been erased from the world as carefully as you might erase writing from a slate. She did not know why Dolores had killed them. She did not know the full story of what had happened to Cecilia Fuentes and the others whose names were recorded in that book. But she knew that it had happened, and that it was still happening, and that it had to stop. The problem was that no one would believe her. She was a prostitute, a woman of no standing or credibility. Dolores was a property owner, a woman of business, a woman with connections to the sheriff and the mayor and the men who ran Corsicana. If Mercy went to the authorities with her story, she would be laughed at best and arrested for theft and slander at worst. Dolores would deny everything. The ledger would disappear or be explained away, and Mercy would find herself hanging from a rope or broken on a cell floor. But there was another way. Mercy began to visit the well again, during the hours when she was supposedly working. She would tell the men who came to the Velvet Rooms that she was not available, and she would slip out to the courtyard instead. She would kneel beside the well and she would speak to Cecilia. She did not tell Cecilia what she had discovered. She instinctively understood that Cecilia already knew. Instead, she listened, and in the listening, she began to understand the story that Cecilia had been trying to tell her. Cecilia Fuentes had arrived at the Velvet Rooms in the summer of 1862. She had been young, perhaps 18 years old, one of many Mexican girls who came to Corsicana, seeking work during the chaos of Reconstruction. Dolores, then a much younger woman herself, had promised Cecilia food and shelter, and eventually the possibility of saving enough money to return to her family with dignity and security. What Cecilia had found instead was debt. Dolores would charge the girls for their food, their clothing, their room. The charge was always more than they could possibly earn, no matter how many men they lay with. The debt grew instead of shrinking, a mathematical trap that was impossible to escape from. When Cecilia had tried to leave, Dolores had stopped her. Dolores had shown her the ledger. Dolores had shown her the locked room on the 3rd floor. And Dolores had said something that had terrified Cecilia into silence. "You are mine now. You will always be mine." Cecilia had tried to escape anyway. She had planned to run during the night, to leave the Velvet Rooms and disappear into the darkness and find her way back to Mexico, where her mother and her younger brother were waiting. But Dolores had caught her. And Dolores, in her rage at being defied, had done something that no one had been prepared for. She had poisoned her, not quickly, not mercifully. She had given Cecilia a drink laced with something that Mercy could not quite understand from the whispers that rose from the well. Something that caused pain, terrible pain, and also confusion. Also the inability to move or cry out. And when Cecilia was nearly dead, Dolores had put her down the well and left her there. And no one had ever known. No one had ever asked questions. Cecilia had simply disappeared, the way so many girls disappeared in towns like Corsicana. But Cecilia's disappearance had not been the end of it. In fact, it had been the beginning of something far worse. Other girls had tried to leave after Cecilia. And each time, Dolores had been forced to make a choice. Let them go and risk them telling the authorities what the Velvet Rooms really was, or silence them forever. Dolores had chosen silence. She had sent 13 women down into the well, each for different reasons. Each one a girl who had tried to escape or who had talked too much to the wrong person, or who had simply become inconvenient or troublesome or too expensive to keep. The well had become Dolores's way of solving her problems, and it had been calling to Mercy, trying to use her as a voice for the dead, as a way to finally make the world acknowledge what had been done. Chapter 4. The Testimony of Stones. In early November, Mercy did something that no one expected. She left the Velvet Rooms, but she did not simply walk out and disappear into the night. Instead, she went to the office of the Corsicana Daily Sun, the newspaper that had been publishing in the town for 6 years, and she asked for the editor. The editor was a man named Thaddeus Crane, a man of perhaps 50 years old, who had come to Corsicana from Dallas, and had the bearing of someone who had seen too much cruelty to be surprised by any more of it. He listened as Mercy told her story. He listened as she described the well, the bones, the ledger, with its record of 13 names. He listened to the story of Cecilia Fuentes and the others, though she did not tell him everything. She did not mention the whispers, the dreams, the way the well had called to her. She kept those parts for herself. When she was finished, Thaddeus Crane was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You understand that this will destroy you as well. Your name will be in the papers. Everyone in Corsicana will know what you have been. Even if Dolores is arrested, so even if she is convicted, you will not be able to escape what you were." "I know," Mercy said, "but I can't let her keep doing this. I can't let those girls stay in the dark forever." Thaddeus Crane nodded slowly. "Then we will do this properly," he said. Within a week, the authorities came to the Velvet Rooms with shovels and picks. They dug up the courtyard and opened the well. They found Cecilia Fuentes' bones, still arranged on that stone platform in the chamber beneath the earth. They found, in the spaces between the bones, traces of poison. Arsenic, it would later be confirmed. They found other bones as well, the remains of the 13 women whose names were written in Dolores's ledger. Dolores was arrested. She was tried. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and it was the greatest scandal Corsicana had ever known. All of Texas knew about it. The newspapers printed every salacious detail. The State Gazette published Thaddeus Crane's account of the poisonings and the well, told with the kind of righteous fury that only a man can muster when confronted with evil. Dolores maintained her innocence. She said that the women had simply run away, that she did not know anything about poison or murder or any of it. But the ledger condemned her. The bones condemned her. The testimony of the other girls who had worked in the Velvet Rooms, testimony that poured out now that the house of silence had been broken, condemned her. She was found guilty of 4 of the murders. The other cases were deemed too old, too covered in the dust of time to prosecute with certainty. She was sentenced to hang. On the morning of her execution, Dolores sent for Mercy. She would not see her. That would have been too dangerous, and besides, Mercy had no desire to see Dolores's face ever again. But Dolores sent a message through the guard. "You will regret this. The well will not let you go. It will follow you wherever you run." Mercy did not believe her, or rather she did not believe the threat the way Dolores intended it, but she knew in her heart that Dolores was speaking a kind of truth. The well would follow her. After Dolores's execution, Mercy left Corsicana. She took her money, and Dolores had indeed saved enough to start again. and she took the newspaper clipping describing the discovery and the trial. She went to Dallas and then to Houston, and she worked in different jobs, different lives. She became a housekeeper. She became a seamstress. She became, finally, a woman who ran a small boarding house in a quiet neighborhood where no one asked questions about her past. But the dreams never stopped. Every night, Mercy dreamed of the well. Every night, she saw Cecilia's face in her dreams, but the face was not angry. The face was peaceful, the face was smiling. And Cecilia would say in that voice that rose from the darkness, "Thank you. Thank you for letting us be remembered. Thank you for letting the world know that we existed." Years later, when Mercy was an old woman, she would write down the story. She would write it all down. The well, the bones, the names in Dolores's ledger, the way she had heard Cecilia calling to her from beneath the earth. She would hide the manuscript in a trunk, and she would tell her niece, before she died, that the trunk contained a story that needed to be read, a story that needed to be remembered. The story of 13 women who had been stolen from the world, and of one woman who had been brave enough to speak their names aloud. The niece would read the manuscript after Mercy's death. She would be horrified and moved by it in equal measure. She would consider publishing it, but ultimately decide against it. There were still people alive who had been connected to the Velvet Rooms, and the family had already suffered enough scandal to last 100 years. But she kept the manuscript. She kept it in the trunk, and she passed it on to her own daughter, who passed it on to her daughter, and so it survived. The story survived, even though Mercy Cline's name eventually faded from memory. The story survived, passed down through generations of women, a warning and a remembrance of what happened beneath the Velvet Rooms in the darkness of a well in Corsicana, Texas. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, if you stand in the right place on a quiet evening in the near dark of late autumn, you can hear it. Not a voice. Exactly. Not a ghost or any supernatural presence, but the echo of history trying to make itself known. The sound of 13 women insisting that they had existed, that they had mattered, that their deaths should not be forgotten. The testimony of stones, the witness of the well, the refusal of the earth itself to keep silent forever.